Welcome to this presentation on economics of biodiversity. We hear this word biodiversity very often, but what has economics to do with a subject from the biosciences? Well, today is World Conservation Day and also the World Cheetah Day. And why does environmental economics study about cheetahs and conservation? So let's move into this subject. What is biodiversity? Plants and animals have found place in literature, music, art, religion, culture, lifestyle for a very long time. But the academic interest in the occurrences of different species of living beings is seen in the writing of entomologist Edward Wilson, considered the father of biodiversity, who wrote in 1965 that we need to be concerned about the loss of biodiversity. This was followed by other writers who also expressed the lack of knowledge of the extent and uses of biodiversity. Since then, biodiversity has become a part of the study in biosciences and in environmental economics too. Since it has implications in economics, we too study this subject on biodiversity. So, what is a biodiversity? Biodiversity essentially means diversity of life forms. There is a huge assortment of forms of life on this earth. Nature and its creation are mysterious, wonderful, complex, and dynamic. We have to save species from extinction, prevent their habitat from destruction, because we know that our economic activities does affect their habitat and their existence. The International Union for Conservation of Nature releases a red list of threatened species. It has 7 levels of conservation. Living beings of least concern, like the crows and pigeons, near threatened animals, vulnerable species. Indian elephant is in the category of endangered species. The Malabar civet is in the critically endangered category. Cheetah is extinct in the wild, and the pink-headed duck is extinct. So we can study the issue of biodiversity from two important perspectives. The first one, we can take it as the anthropocentric, utilitarian, or the instrumental way of looking at biodiversity. This is essentially the idea that the existence of biodiversity is for the benefit of mankind. Production and consumption of goods and services rely on the resources that we take from nature, and therefore all that is available on this earth is meant for human beings. Biocentric approach essentially looks at these members of the biosphere as having inherent wealth. Therefore, we need to develop an appreciation and deeper understanding of species, ecosystems, and the interconnectedness of the living world. It is only when we appreciate this we can avoid mismanagement, misuse, and destruction of biodiversity. And this is necessary for the very utilitarian purposes of biodiversity, that is, to have a sustainable supply of biological resources. The Convention on Biodiversity in 1992 focused the global attention on biodiversity loss, preservation, and conservation of species. So biological diversity includes two components. One is the abiotic component, which provides the habitat for the living beings, and the other is the living being who are a part of this biosphere. So biodiversity includes the variation within the species, between species, and with the and how they live within this ecosystem. This convention brought about a global attention to this issue, and thereafter countries have been putting effort of conserving biodiversity. We can now look at the levels of biodiversity. The first level of biodiversity exists in the diversity of genes in living organisms. These genes are passed on from parents to offspring, and these genes give the unique character of that particular organism. So, when genetic diversity helps in adapting to changing environments, ensuring some species survive, even though some may be at the risk of being lost due to environmental destruction. Turtles, for example, are of different genes, and in spite of all the challenges, some turtles have survived, whereas the Mahanadi turtle, which belongs to to Orissa, has completely disappeared from this earth. The second level of diversity is known as species diversity. This is based on the similarities by which the species are grouped into families. Species diversity includes both species richness and species evenness. So this includes a wide range of insects and crabs and worms, snails, and so on. Rainforest, for example, is species rich, while the polluted rivers are species poor because not many species survive in polluted waters. We can also say that foxes and wolves are separate species. The pink-headed duck is an extinct species in India. Let's look at another term, ecosystem diversity. There is a large variety of ecosystems that are available on this earth. These provide different habitats for different kinds of animals and different communities of animals, and there are different ecological processes that happen in these ecosystems. So this is also called as landscape diversity. Deserts, mountains, wetlands, and so on. Animals, plants, bacteria, fungi, and other living organisms live and grow in specific physical area which has got different components of air, water, soil, and climatic conditions. Interactions takes place between these species in terms of food web, reproduction, and decomposition. Let's now look at the economics of biodiversity. All economic activities depend upon ecosystems for their resources. In the process of obtaining these resources for carrying out economic activities, there is a lot of destruction that happens to the biodiversity by this human intervention. The third aspect that we need to understand from an economic point of view is when we destroy these ecosystems, the production processes itself get distorted. Therefore, from an utilitarian perspective, from a neoclassical framework, we need to see how to conserve the biodiversity. Conservation of biodiversity is expensive. Therefore, the question is, do we want to destroy biodiversity now and then spend resources on conservation of biodiversity? Some of the important concepts that can be used to understand the economics of biodiversity are as follows. Utility and welfare. We understand that all these resources from nature provide us utility, and therefore it improves our welfare. Neoclassical economics permits that all resources that are brought and sold in the market are determined by price mechanism. However, we need to also understand that many resources of the biosphere cannot be put under the price tag, and therefore the market mechanism fails to price biodiversity resources. It is in this case that the economics of environment has now developed certain tools that can be used for valuation of environment. But here also we should understand that it has not been possible, for example, how to find the money value of the earthworm that is under the soil. It's not possible. Therefore, we need to understand that many of the resources that are there on this earth, we will never know the economic value of them until we lose those creations. Before any project is taken up, we need to understand that the tool of cost benefit analysis can be used. It is not the cost of setting up of a railway line that needs to be taken into consideration. It also needs to see what are the other kinds of costs that are involved. How many trees are going to be cut, what is the habitat that is going to be destroyed, and how is the landscape of that area going to be disturbed. So these kind of studies have now been taken up in economics. These biosystem resources do not belong to anyone, they belong to nature, and therefore it is treated as a public good. Since it is treated as a public good, it becomes important in developing institutions that will conserve these resources. Government's role in conservation becomes very important, and therefore economics has to understand how it is going to allocate resources for the conservation of these biodiversity. When we talk about conservation of resources, we need to look at it from a theoretical perspective. We can say that the conservation can be viewed from the concept of interest. So when we save resources now for the future, we get a return on that saved amount, which is called as interest. So is it possible that we don't use all the resources now and save it for the future because it will give benefit for us in the future? Or are we willing to discount the resources of the future and consume it in the present? So there are decisions that have to be taken on such matters. As much as there is the risk and uncertainty theory that we use to study profit can be applied to study biodiversity. For example, what is the risk of destruction of biodiversity of particular kind? What is going to be the outcome? Is it worth taking those kind of risks? And what is the certainty that conservation effort will give us the desired outcome in terms of preservation of biodiversity? Loss of any gene, species, or ecosystem is known as biodiversity loss. Biodiversity loss is the weakening of the capability of life to reproduce itself and survive. When population of species decline to a point where they are considered endangered, the unique genetic material that is available in these species of animals also decline. There is limited knowledge about Earth's rich biodiversity, and we have not been able to even catalog the entire species that inhabit this Earth. Therefore, even before these species are catalogued, we may have lost many of them, and we may continue to lose many if we do not take care of this biodiversity. We need to understand what are those economic activities that are causing loss to biodiversity. Biodiversity is extremely complicated, and the listing of processes indicate that there might be overlapping of some processes into the other, but nevertheless, all these processes together cause biodiversity. So the first one is changes in the land use pattern. Land in India is, for example, classified into 9 different categories: fallow land, grazing land, agricultural land, culturable land, and so on. This categorization of land is important because it prevents the misuse of land or using land for other purposes than what it is intended for. Whenever there is a change in the land use, that is, agriculture land is being converted for industrial purposes, or fallow lands are being converted for urban requirement, in all of these cases there are changes in the land use pattern. These land use pattern also changes the habitats of the many creatures that live on that. These result in the disturbance to the vegetation, and that is which is a host to countless number of species, bacteria, and other forms of microorganisms. Changes in land use pattern threaten and destroy breeding, feeding, nesting of birds, mammals, insects, and other microbial organisms. All this result in biodiversity loss. Unsustainable agriculture practice is another important reason for biodiversity loss. With the population increase and increases in income, we find there is an increased demand for plant-based and animal-based food. To provide these increased demand for food, more land has to be brought into cultivation. There is an intensification and commercialization of agriculture that is happening, which demands more use of pesticides, fertilizers, hybrid seeds, and energy. At the same time, to meet the increased demand for animal food, more land has to grow fodder. And this is another reason why lands which were hitherto unused have been used for agricultural practices. Agriculture practices has also seen monocropping and the use of technology, which have both destroyed the biodiversity of the agriculture fields, where numerous microorganisms survive in those areas. Monoculture is the growing of any one species, and this entails in the risk of eliminating certain flora and fauna. Is another important reason for the biodiversity loss. We know that forests are the habitat for innumerable living beings. Preservation of forest is essential for maintaining the richness of life. And deforestation occurs due to multiple drivers which are mainly economic in character. Clearing of the forest land for agriculture purposes, for infrastructure development, for extracting wood and forest produce, all of this put burden on the forest. And these are supported by various institutional and legal changes which also cause harm to the forest. This loss of forest cover means a loss of habitat for many creatures. It also means that animals have to stray away from their known habitat to unknown habitat, and finally they cause harm to human beings, like how the animals, wild animals, are straying away from forest land into human habitation, causing death and loss of property and lives. But where do these animals go when we have extended our economic activities into their habitat? The issue of alien species is not something that we are very well conversant with, because it is not a subject that we see much in our day-to-day lives. But this is the fourth important factor or process that cause biodiversity loss. These invasive species are those microorganism plants or animals that are relocated from their native place of habitation to new habitation through trade. Usually it happens through international trade. They latch on to the agriculture commodities that come from distant countries into this country, and thus fight geographical barriers and also reproductive barriers, and settle in new areas. When they settle in the new habitat, they compete with the existing local animals for nesting sites, for water bodies, and for habitat. By this, in the long run, they destroy the native species of that particular In India, we can have examples of the papaya bug that has adversely affected the cultivation of the fruit papaya. The other very important three species that we know of is the lantana weed, the parthenium weed, and the water hyacinth weed, which have come from different parts of the world, and they have made it into this land. So once they come here, they become very active, and and some of them are toxic that even cattle cannot eat them, but they destroy the nutrient of the soil and also occupy space, and very difficult to remove them once they have established in a new place. Any kind of pollution is harmful for or living beings. Now, there is in the water bodies, when there is an overload of nutrients because of flow of polluted water into the lake, this affects the fish in the water and the many algae and microorganisms that grow inside these water bodies. So the lakes, rivers, estuaries, and coastal waters suffer from this water, from this kind of eutrophication, and we know that fish kills are very common in polluted water. The consequence of marine pollution is also understood when many varieties of fish and microorganisms get killed forever. Fishing is a source of livelihood for many, but also fishes are a primary source of protein for people in many parts of the world. Overfishing, because of technological development and demand, has resulted in declining fish population, and this has affected many species of fish. Of the coral reefs are also being affected because of this kind of unsustainable draw of resources from these coral reefs. The aquifer depletion, that is the overuse of groundwater, has been another cause for animals to move away from their known habitat to unknown habitat in search of water. Eventually, if this problem of groundwater increases, again we could experience the loss of many creatures on this earth. Mining caused disturbance of the existing landscape. It results in felling of trees. It builds up mine waste. It results in air pollution, noise pollution, and vibration due to the mine blast, all of which are harmful to living creatures. This also pollutes both the groundwater and surface water, and further accentuates the problem of harm to the living beings. Mining also results in the construction of roads to increase human accessibility to areas where resources are available. Timber is exploited more easily, and it all results in the destruction of habitat for living beings. And we know that in course of time, much of the habitat of those animals will be completely destroyed. We can understand that when large patches of land are done into parts by creating barriers, we have actually fragmented land. And fragmented land with abrupt boundaries appear in these patches of land. Large habitats are transformed into smaller habitat or smaller patches of land with smaller total area from each other, and then the habitats are no longer like the original. Wild animals, some of them require large spaces of land for their survival. But when fragmentation of land happens, that kind of situation is lost for these wild animals. Dams are a major contributor to this fragmentation, as much as construction of roadways, big national highways and roadways are a cause of destruction to this habitat. Building of fences around forest area to prevent animals from to prevent the movement of animals is another way in which fragmentation of land is done, and this again causes loss of biodiversity. Climate change is an issue that everyone is aware of, and nations of the world are struggling to see how to combat this climate change. Climate change is essentially generalized warming of the Earth's surface, rising sea levels, changes in precipitation rates. This in turn will cause loss of a life because it will affect the biodiversity. So, the overall story is that the increasing aspiration for economic development and economic growth has resulted in much damage to the environment. Policymakers have woken up to this challenge and have thought that conservation is a way out to protect the biodiversity. The conservation of biodiversity takes place in two forms or two approaches. The first one is called the in situ conservation, which means the conservation of animals in its natural habitat. So, reserved forest, protected forest, community forests, there are very many forms of this conservation approach. The recent import of cheetahs from Namibia into the country was an example of in situ conservation in its natural habitat. The, the other approach to conservation of species is the more familiar one, which is the ex situ conservation approach. Animals are brought into enclosures, which is what we know in India as the zoo. The next video will be on markets and externalities. Thank you.